Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about subsidies, the other subcategory of unfair trade practices. So we have covered the first one, dumping, in our previous session, and today we're going to talk about subsidization of products as another type of unfair trade practices. Why? Because here we can observe an interesting historic trend. Subsidies became increasingly popular after GATT members or WTO members increasingly opened their markets. So on the one hand, they abolished quite restrictions, or most of them. On the other hand, they gradually but steadily lowered their tariffs. What meant, and that led to the effect that their domestic producers had to face more and more competition from abroad. And to help them face this competition, to remain competitive or to remain in the game at all, they were subsidized by their respective governments. So again, subsidies on the one hand are an important political tool to help producers to not only remain competitive but to survive in the first place when facing more and more foreign competition. On the other hand, however, subsidies have a negative impact on international trade. Why? Because they prevent market forces from doing their magic from an economist's point of view. They prevent the free market to lead to a situation where the most efficient producers are the winners in this game. So also inefficient producers, by virtue of subsidies, can remain competitive, and not because they're efficient, not because of the quality of their products. And as we will also discover today, in particular when it comes to agricultural products, there are some special rules which are on the one hand understandable, on the other hand, however, prevent in particular poorer countries from being able to benefit from their comparative advantage in the agricultural sector. But without further ado, let's go and start with the general aspects of subsidies and rules on subsidies. There are two different types of rules. On the one hand, those that govern subsidies themselves, namely Article 16 of the GATT and Articles 3 to 9 of the so-called SCM agreement, which stands for Subsidies and Countervailing Measures. And then secondly, there are rules that govern the actual imposition of countervailing duties, so the reactions a state or a WTO member may take against subsidized imports on its market. Article 6 of the GATT, the provision governing anti-dumping duties, is also governing countervailing duties, so the duties that may be imposed as a reaction to the importation of subsidized products, and then in more detail Articles 10 to 23 of the SCM agreement. Before we start and go into detail, however, keep in mind that there are many very complex but however also very fascinating cases at the WTO. You could say legal battles, long-lasting legal battles, among them in particular the Boeing versus Airbus saga. So remember, this one has been going on ever since the 1980s. This dispute is older than the WTO is, and if you read the headlines these days, you will see that it is still keeping the WTO and trade lawyers busy until this very day. The prime example of a dispute at the WTO concerning subsidies and two of the major economic players, namely the European Union and the United States. What is a subsidy then? This is one of the words that everyone would have a definition for, but when asked about details or to provide a very specific one, you might have troubles. So as the WTO itself defines a subsidy, and here you see with this definition you already have a reference to its impact. So a subsidy that distorts the allocation of resources within an economy should be subject to discipline. This is the rationale behind that. So whereas subsidy is widely available within an economy, such a distortion in the allocation of resources is presumed not to occur. So, in other words, if you define a subsidy as merely granting money to a large number of producers inside of a country, and in other words, it is widely available, that does not necessarily mean that there is a distortion when it comes to allocation. But once there is such a distortion, then there should be some rules applicable on that inside of a country, and obviously enough also on a global market. So that's the rationality behind it. Once again, this is unfair trade, but you want market forces to work, you want efficiency to work here and not political forces, i.e. having friends or good connections to a government in order to receive a subsidy and therefore an unfair advantage over other competitors from other countries. The mere definition that you find in WTO law is subcategorized or can be further characterized and divided into three parts. First, you need a financial contribution. Second, the financial contribution needs to be granted by the government in a broad sense, so including public bodies within the territory of a WTO member. And last but not least, the financial contribution or other contribution needs to confer a benefit. So after receiving the subsidy, you're better off in simple terms. What is a financial contribution then? This is a very, very broad term. So obviously enough, it can involve a direct transfer of funds, so a grant, a loan, an equity infusion, or also a potential direct transfer of fund. Then, however, also passive action. I know this is somewhat contradictory, but passivity, in other words, so an omission can also constitute a financial contribution. So government revenue that is foregone or not collected. So tax exemptions granted to a company, if you say, okay, you will not be taxed or only a lower tax will be applicable for this or that company, that obviously can also amount to a financial contribution, even although there is no direct payment, but it is foregone, so it is not collected. It means that the government abstains from doing something. Then the provision by a government of goods or services are also considered as financial contributions. So as I already said, this is not a restrictive interpretation of this term. General infrastructure does not fall under the notion of contributions, of final contributions, because they are widely available, i.e. to everyone, but at the same time, however, there might be an intermix. So in one case from the late 1980s surrounding subsidies for Airbus, the airport of Bremen constructed a way and a highway, you could say, for planes, and that one, however, was designed in such a way, or it was further constructed in such a way that Airbus could transport wings from one place to the other. So it was directly constructed or specifically constructed for Airbus. So this is not general infrastructure, might also constitute and was held to constitute a financial contribution in the sense of the definition of subsidies. Also, the purchase by a government of certain goods, if that is not falling under government procurement, but in general may also constitute a subsidy. So if a government decides to buy from a company that is having financial troubles, that might however also constitute a financial contribution. And then last but not least, government's payments to a funding mechanism or financial contributions that are channeled through a private body, if they ultimately however derive from a government, they may also constitute a financial contribution for the purposes of WTO law. Then, however, the second major criterion here, that it has to be granted by a government or any public body within the territory of a member, includes not only the government as such, so the federal government, but also local or regional governments. And the term public body is also a very broad one, so all legal entities or all entities that possess or exercise or are vested with governmental authority. So if it's not the state itself, but someone acting on behalf of a state by performing actions that only a state can do, it is also considered as a public body in the sense of the subsidies definition. However, if an enterprise, a company is 100% owned by a state, or also to some level controlled by a state, so the definition of state-owned enterprises in WTO law, it is not automatically a public body in the sense of the subsidies definition. It also needs governmental authority. So if you think of the case US Countervailing Measures concerning China, that was a case dealing with subsidies granted by China to Chinese producers, Chinese manufacturers. However, the WTO in this case held that the mere fact that a company is owned by the state or maybe even controlled by a state is not sufficient. It also needs some level of public authority, of quasi-governmental authority. And last but not least, you need a certain benefit. what at the end of the day, simply put, you're better off after receiving the subsidy than before that. So, and these terms are more favorable than those available to the recipient on the market. So if you could get a loan at a private bank, but however, if you get it from the government, it's cheaper, then for example, it's a subsidy. The actual costs to the government, however, are irrelevant when making this determination. And now, having defined subsidies in a broad sense, we have to go further into detail about the specificity of subsidies. And these are regulated in Article 2, which says that only those subsidies that are considered as specific are also regulated by the SCM agreement. There are two different types of specificity. First, de jure, and second, de facto. De jure is the first category, and this is the first check you have to do. This also goes back to the assessment of the appellate body of the WTO in the US Countervailing Measures, i.e. China case. So, as it was held by the appellate body here, the language of the subparagraphs A and B of Article 2 of the SCM agreement directs an investigating authority to scrutinize any explicit limitation of access to a subsidy or look for the existence of objective conditions or criteria governing eligibility for a subsidy. And then, furthermore, in cases where an examination of the nature and content of the challenged measure indicates that access to a subsidy is explicitly limited to certain enterprises, or if there are criteria or conditions governing the eligibility for a subsidy that are spelled out in law, regulation, or other official document, and then an investigating authority will normally begin by examining this evidence in light of the subparagraphs A and B, i.e. whether there is de jure specificity. So, concerning the first subparagraph A, that holds that where the granting authority, so the government but also local or regional bodies, or the legislation pursuant to which the granting authority operates, so again also a public body on the basis of laws and regulation, if this authority or the legislation explicitly limits access to a subsidy to certain enterprises, then the subsidy is considered as specific. These certain enterprises will be further discussed in a few minutes. And then, however, Article 2(1) subparagraph B makes it clear that there are certain situations where there is no specificity, i.e. if there are, and I quote again the original provision, objective criteria or conditions governing the eligibility for and the amount of a subsidy. However, if, there is an eligibility to this extent has been established by law and in objective criteria, it has to be automatic, and these criteria and conditions are also in practice, i.e. by the granting authority, strictly adhered to. And last but not least in this regard, these criteria or conditions, they have to be clearly spelled out in law, regulation, or other official document so as to be capable of verification. So if it's not written anywhere, you can verify whether it exists and how it is being applied in practice. And here again I would like to refer to one of the main cases on subsidies in general and de jure and de facto subsidies in particular, the question as to what constitutes de jure and de facto specificity, the appellate body in US Countervailing Measures, China. Again, if the evidence suggests that a subsidy is not de jure specific, however, then Article C makes it clear that the specificity inquiry does not necessarily end at that point. Why not? Because you also have to then go on and say, okay, even if it's not de jure specific, for example, because Article 2(1)b is applicable here and the criteria set out therein are fulfilled, so strictly speaking there is no de jure, and it's clear that there is no de jure specificity, you then have to ask the question, but maybe there is de facto specificity. And there are other, so-called other factors that have to be taken into account to determine whether there might still be specificity. So for example, if a subsidy program is only used in practice by a limited number of certain enterprises, or there is a predominant use of a subsidy program by certain enterprises, or there are disproportionately large subsidies that are being granted to certain enterprises, and last but not least, if the manner in which the discretion has been exercised by the granting authority implies that there is de facto specificity, then again this criterion set out in Article 2.1 subparagraph C is also fulfilled. And that means there are 4 types of specificity. Enterprise specificity, if the government targets a particular company or a number of particular companies for its subsidization as part of its subsidization program. There is industry specificity, i.e. a certain sector or certain sectors are being targeted with a subsidy program. There is regional specificity, when a government tries to help producers in a certain part of its territory, in a certain region. And last but not least, all subsidies that are prohibited, will come to that. So there are also subcategories concerning which subsidies are prohibited and which subsidies can only be challenged but are not prima facie or ab initio prohibited. But if it is prohibited, and there are 2 categories of subsidies that are always prohibited: export subsidies, so subsidies that are being granted to help a company export and are on the basis or on the precondition that products will be exported, they are granted, or import substitution subsidies, which are also self-explanatory. They are granted under the condition that import is being substituted here. And then, however, there are also, as I said, in addition to these prohibited subsidies, actionable subsidies, so they can be challenged, but as long as they are not challenged, however, they are not a problem from the WTO law perspective. And last but not least, there are also non-actionable subsidies, which are, however, from today's perspective, no longer relevant, but they were originally also enshrined in the SCM agreement. Prohibited subsidies, as I already mentioned, export subsidies are contingent upon export performance, and import substitution subsidies are contingent upon the use of domestic over imported products, as the name already says. And contingent, that means if the granting process of a certain subsidy is, again, either de jure or de facto conditional or dependent on the export performance or the import substitution. So it's a precondition for the grant of such a subsidy, but the mere grant itself to an export-oriented firm is not sufficient. So just because you have a certain power player on your market, think in Austria, for example, of Red Bull or First Alpine, only because they receive a subsidy, that by itself does not mean that it is a prohibited subsidy. You need more than that. It has to be contingent upon a certain export performance, for example. When it comes to dispute settlement rules governing prohibited subsidies, there are some aspects that have to be considered here. First, the timeframes in this connection are halved. So the regular timeframes that you have in the dispute settlement mechanism system of the WTO is now cut by half. You have less time. In other words, once a WTO member challenges a prohibited subsidy at the WTO. Why? Because you want it to be removed as soon as possible, because as the name already says, it is prohibited. Then, if the measure is indeed found to constitute a prohibited subsidy by the WTO, it has to be withdrawn without delay. So the panel, so the quasi-court of first instance at the WTO, would then specify a certain time period, but usually as soon as possible. And if there is no compliance, then the WTO, as always, may authorize other appropriate countermeasures, which we will discuss in more detail in our session on WTO dispute settlement. So whether you can then raise your tariffs, for example, as a reaction to subsidized products. Actionable subsidies, then, these are the main categories of specific subsidies. They are not prohibited per se, but they can be challenged if, and that is the precondition here, and this is also the major difference to prohibited subsidies, if they cause adverse effects to the interests of another WTO member, broadly speaking. What that means, however, in practice, and which we will discuss in a few minutes, immaterial injury or threat of injury to the domestic producers or producing the like product to the subsidized products. there are 3 types of adverse effects, and they can be found in Article 5 of the SCM agreement: injury, serious, actual or threat prejudice, and a nullification or impairment of benefits accruing directly or indirectly to other members. The first one means that there is an injury to the domestic industry producing a like product. You find definitions of like product, for example, in footnote 46 to the SCM agreement. You find the definition of what is domestic industry, what is material injury, or the threat of material injury, and the requirement of a causal link between the importation of subsidized imports and the injury caused to domestic producers of like products, and all of them are vastly similar to the anti-dumping agreement. So likeness is defined similar to the one in the anti-dumping agreement. Domestic injury, a major proportion of those engaged in the production of a certain product, and also the requirement of causal link, that other factors again cannot be, or you cannot be, if they cannot be attributed to the subsidized imports, then they have to be taken out of the equation. So everything we said in connection with anti-dumping is also relevant when it comes to subsidies. Then serious and actual prejudice or a threat of prejudice if the subsidy, and that is given if the subsidy displaces or impedes the import of a like product, if it displaces or impedes the export of a like product of another member into the market of a third country. So also indirect impacts are also falling under this notion of adverse effects, or if the subsidy results in a significant price undercutting by the subsidized product in comparison to the like product of another member in the same market, or in significant price suppression, price depression, or lost sales on a given market, or if the subsidy leads to an increase in the world market share of the WTO member in a particularly primary product or commodity. So this is a very broad concept of adverse effect that is by the regulated, or that falls under the notion of the second type of adverse effects. And then the third type of adverse effects, nullification or impairment of benefits accruing directly or indirectly to other members. That means benefits that arise from tariff concessions. Why? Because once again, subsidies, they can undermine improved market access that results from tariff concessions. Why? Because on the one hand, you have opened your market. On the other hand, however, a subsidy, as I indicated at the very beginning, is also meant to help domestic companies to face foreign competition. So it's not protectionism per se or only indirectly, but nevertheless distorts market forces to do their work as expected, at least in economic theory. When it comes to dispute settlement concerning actionable subsidies, you have to look at Article 7 of the SCM agreement. Once again, there are also shorter time frames than in WTO dispute settlement in general, but they're not as short as when it comes to prohibited subsidies. And if a panel or the appellate body of the WTO finds that a subsidy causes adverse effects, as we just described, then the member who is subsidizing products can either take appropriate steps to remove these adverse effects, or it has to withdraw the subsidy within 6 months. If that doesn't happen, once again, countermeasures can be authorized by the WTO, so higher tariffs, for example. And a third category that shall be briefly mentioned here, but for the time being, however, that's only a historic one, are so-called non-actionable subsidies. So certain types of specific subsidies were, at least originally in the SCM agreement, not considered as specific for understandable reasons. So development assistance to certain disadvantaged regions inside of a given country. That would be regional specificity, but if it was a region that is having economic or social political problems and is being granted money or financial benefits, then it would not be considered as a subsidy, which is understandable. However, for the time being today, the safe harbor has lapsed, was never renewed, and therefore this type of subsidy is also actionable if it falls under the notion of specificity. Or similarly, also assistance to promote the adaptation of existing facilities to new environmental requirements, also perfectly understandable. if the environment has changed and you grant a subsidy to help adjust to such a change, however, it should not be considered as a subsidy because it is understandable, but nevertheless also for the time being constitutes a specific or usually an actionable subsidy, and also assistance for research activities today also might constitute a specific subsidy. But historically speaking, at the very beginning, all of them were exempted from the SCM agreement. They were explicitly considered as non-specific. And what can you do if there is a subsidy? You may impose so-called countervailing measures. So that is the equivalent to anti-dumping duties. You cannot only challenge a prohibited or an actionable subsidy, but as a WTO member, you can also act unilaterally. You can impose a so-called countervailing duty with respect to any specific subsidy that causes injury to your domestic industry. In other words, so both of these requirements have to be fulfilled. And as an earlier step, however, once there has been a preliminary determination that imports are subsidized and they cause injury, and they themselves and are not only correlated or related to this injury, but actually have led to this injury, a threat of injury, then you can impose provisional countervailing measures, so already before the final determination has been finished, or you can also resort to so-called voluntary undertakings. They are regulated in Article 18 of the SCM agreement, where the government of the exporting member subsidizing products agrees to eliminate or limit the subsidy or take other measures concerning the effects of its subsidy. Or, what is also the second type of voluntary undertakings, the exporter might itself agree to revise its prices so that the investigating authorities are satisfied that the injurious effect of the subsidy is eliminated. So either the state granting the subsidy is doing something voluntarily to prevent countervailing measures from being applied, or the exporter itself is taking such actions. These are the two categories of voluntary undertakings. For countervailing measures then, so final countervailing measures, not provisional ones, the requirements are spelled out in Article 6 of the GATT and Article 10 and 32 of the SCM agreement. And as we said already, once again, subsidized imports having a causal link to an injury or the threat of injury and causing such an actual material injury to the domestic industry producing like products, then you can take action against that. Concerning the actual imposition and collection of such definitive countervailing duties, we have to look at Articles 19 to 21 of the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement, and these articles provide that a countervailing duty, a final countervailing duty first, may never exceed the amount of the subsidy. So similar to anti-dumping measures, this is not meant as a sort of punishment, this is not meant as a sort of retaliation, but you simply want to re-establish fairness, an even playing field again. And there is also in addition the lesser duty rule, which holds that if the amount of the injury is less than the full amount of the subsidy, then it should be limited to the necessary amount and not, in other words, not be made full use of the margin of countervailing measures or countervailing duties that may be applied because the actual subsidy is higher than the injury itself. Second, also, these countervailing duties should only be applied as long as and to the extent necessary to counteract the injurious subsidy. So you have to undertake as a state a periodic review once they no longer cause an injury or as they are no longer having any impact, these subsidized imports, then the countervailing duties shall be lifted. And similar to anti-dumping duties, again, there is a maximum level or maximum period of 5 years, unless, however, the sunset review, so the review that is being done at the end of the day when the sunset begins, when this review establishes that the end or the abolition, the elimination of a countervailing duty is likely to lead to a continuation or repetition of the subsidization and of the injury caused by it. Then it can be applied, the countervailing duty can be applied for longer than 5 years. Last but not least, I would like to mention two special subtopics concerning subsidies. First, special and differential treatment of developing countries, and then secondly, which however is somewhat related, special rules when it comes to agricultural products. When least developed countries, commonly abbreviated as LDCs, subsidize their products, or also poorer developing countries also subsidize their products to be exported to other countries, then these export subsidies are not prohibited, but they're treated just like actionable subsidies. So here again, if a poor country tries to make some of its producers, some of its industries more competitive on a global market by granting subsidies, that is by itself not prohibited, but it can nevertheless still be challenged by other WTO members. Plus, there are certain de minimis thresholds for countervailing duties against subsidized imports from developing countries. So the overall level of the subsidy, if it is lower than 2% ad valorem, so added to the value of a product, then there shall be no countervailing duties. If the volume of the subsidized imports is less than 4% of the total imports of the like product of the important member, then there shall also be no countervailing duties against such imports from developing countries. And however, if the collective import or the collective share of imports from developing country members is higher than 9% of the total import of like products, then nevertheless, because of the bundled impact of such imports, then you can impose countervailing duties. And last but not least, a few words on agricultural subsidies. As you may imagine, this is a very delicate topic because on the one hand, this is where developing country WTO members have a comparative advantage, lower labor cost, also perhaps because their specific industries focused or specialized on agriculture, so this is where they might be competitive for a variety of reasons, but at the same time they are prevented from making full use of their comparative advantage, and even more so, richer countries also tend to have a very negative impact on the agricultural sectors in developing countries by giving out subsidies. What are however, the main policy reasons why richer countries or richer regions like the European Union grant high subsidies to their farmers, for example? Policy reasons. On the one hand, you don't want to be dependent on agricultural products from other countries. You want to be self-sustainable, for example. You want some level of autarky, in other words. Or, for example, you'd say they have higher health standards, higher environmental standards. These are all of the reasons, and there are also additional reasons why richer countries or richer regions grant high subsidies to their domestic producers of agricultural products, and why there is also a special agreement on agriculture with certain rules governing agricultural export subsidies and domestic agricultural support measures. So an export subsidy for agricultural product, as specified in the respective WTO members' goods schedule, they are not prohibited. Countries, WTO members, have only committed themselves to reduce these export subsidies, but they are not obliged to eliminate them altogether. Plus, there are certain exceptions for some categories of support measures if they do not, or to the extent that they do not constitute price support to agricultural producers, so-called green box subsidies and blue box subsidies. Green box subsidies, these refer to public stockholding for food security purposes. So as we said already, a country does not want to face a situation if it's dependent on the importation of food that all of a sudden there are no longer any imports. If it says we will save for rainy days, that is not considered as a subsidy or as a prohibited subsidy or as a challenge, an actionable subsidy. Domestic aid, at the same time for certain regions, or payments for relief from natural disasters in case of a flood, for example, are also not considered or not considered as subsidies, as actionable or challengeable subsidies. And then blue box subsidies are defined as those that are designed to encourage agriculture and rural development if they are Then again, also if there are subsidies below certain de minimis levels, so only very low ones, and also certain payments that are aimed at limiting agricultural production. So if you have overproduction, possibly also because of subsidies, and then if you would say, okay, the next year we have to produce less, so you are paid for doing less. This is some of the absurdities of subsidies in the agricultural sector. They are also exempted by virtue of the Agreement on Agriculture, and these are so-called blue box subsidies. But the last point I want to emphasize in this connection, again, subsidies on agricultural products, as understandable as they might be from our perspective, from the Western perspective, from the perspective of richer countries, you don't want to be dependent on foreign imports, you want to be self-sustainable to some extent, particularly during the coronavirus crisis. That is painfully obvious. You don't want to depend on the import of products, or at least not 100% depend on the import from other countries. At the same time, however, this is where poorer countries have their comparative advantage. And this is one of their main accusations directed towards Western or richer countries. Say, you don't want us to keep our markets closed, but at the same time, you're trying to offset our comparative advantage by granting subsidies to your farmers, and then your products end up in our markets and destroy our markets because we're simply unable to compete with heavily subsidized agricultural products from Western countries. So this is one of the key issues whenever it comes to trade negotiations at the WTO level and also outside of the WTO. Having said that, I would conclude today's session. I hope it was interesting for all of you. In the next one, I will talk about safeguards, so temporary restrictions of imports of a product to, in other words, to protect domestic industries from a sudden and unexpected surge of imports of certain products. These are, however, not unfair trade practices. When we speak about unfair trade in the sense of WTO law, we talk about anti-dumping and of subsidies. Good. In this sense, I would like to thank you for the attention, and depending on the time you're watching this, have a great start in the day, a great rest of the day, a good evening, or a good night. Goodbye.